Yes, good morning. Happy Friday to everyone. I call this meeting to order and welcome to this meeting of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. And before we get started, I'd like to ask all members, we don't have any witnesses today, to take a quick look at the cardboard thing in front of you about the health and safety of interpreters and all, particularly interpreters, who we'd like to thank warmly for their work. Today's meeting is for the purpose of committee business.
We start, you've seen the calendar that's in front of you. So with the clerk, we've been trying hard to get to respect the motion that was sent to us by the House and have the witnesses that are named to be invited and confirmed. They've all been invited. Some are confirmed, some we still have some work to do, but I think we've got a pretty good schedule going forward. And just as a note of information on next Monday, we're going to have a double meeting, so 4 hours. And the Monday after that, two most like, and so that both Mondays coming forward, just so that we can get through this motion before the deadline, which is on December 17th. So take a look at the calendar. This is going to help us. I see you, Mr. Turnbull. But just before we start the discussion, and Mr. Perkins next, before we start the discussion, I'll just get this out of the way. We've got a request for supplementary project budget that you've seen. I think the clerk has distributed it. Is it the will of the committee to approve this request for extra budget? I see everyone nodding in agreement, so it is approved. Thank you very much. And so, given that we have a lot of motions outstanding, I've seen Mr. Perkins asking the floor, and then I have I've seen Mr. Turnbull, and then Mr. Perkins. So Mr. Turnbull, and then Mr. Patzer, and then Mr. Massey. Mr. Turnbull, floor is yours.
Point of order,
Chair. M'inscrire aussi dans la liste.
Et Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Point of order, Chair.
Yes.
Even before I was kind of already waving for your attention there, I believe the clerk had seen me waving earlier in the meeting already to have the floor.
Mr. Patzer, I've seen Mr. Turnbull first raise his hand, and then Mr. Perkins, and I believe you were third. So apologies for that. Mr. Turnbull, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. So, colleagues, I know today we're considering committee business. So I want to put something else on the floor here for our consideration as a committee. So I'm going to move the following motion. I'll read it into the record, and we will provide it in both official languages by email in just a moment. So given that governments have an economic and social incentive to act on climate change, and given that climate change could lead to devastating impacts on Canadian businesses and industry, with climate damages and economic losses of up to $35 billion per year by 2030, and $865 billion by the year 2100, or 6 times the revenues of Canada's most populous provinces in the absence of climate action. Given that the energy, forestry, mining, agricultural, and fisheries sectors will be particularly affected, putting many local economies at risk. Given these sectors contribute to the economies of hundreds of municipalities and communities across the country. Given that climate change in turn may impact labor markets, employment, and wage growth, particularly in the absence of climate action. And that industry supports industrial carbon pricing as the backbone of decarbonization across the country, spurring growth, especially in lower intensive sectors of the economy, job growth, and greener projects, and that industry has called on governments to work together to strengthen Canada's industrial pricing system. That the committee allocate no less than 2 meetings to study the topic of industrial carbon pricing, as well as the broader industrial and labor market impacts of climate change. So that's the motion. I'm just going to speak to that briefly. So this letter, I believe, was tabled with the committee October 23rd, 2024. It's from some of our very large industrial producers, so the Canadian manufacturers and exporters were signatories to the letter, the Canadian Steel Producers Association, Alberta's Industrial Heartland, the Capital Investment Destination, Carbon Removal Canada, Canadian Renewable Energy Association, the Cement Association of Canada, Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, and the list goes on, Lafarge, Clean Prosperity, and others. So I think it's important for us to consider this as a topic of study. It's clear to me that the coalition of industry players here is calling on us, as well as provincial governments, to work together to strengthen our industrial carbon pricing system in Canada, which has its challenges. If you read the letter that they've put forward, there's quite a number of barriers that are created by the patchwork of systems that we have across each province and territory. And perhaps I won't go into more depth on that because there's more information, and I'm sure if the committee decides to study this that we'll get a chance to look at what specifically those trade barriers and misalignments are and what impacts they have on having a strong industrial carbon pricing system in Canada. I will say, though, that, I think this is an area where the federal government can help to eliminate barriers and red tape by working closely with provinces and territories. And I think that that's an exciting prospect for us here at this committee, that we can sort of undertake some work to look at that and say, okay, what could we recommend that would be helpful? This group has called upon, governments at all levels to look at this and to work together. So I think that's incumbent upon us to respond to their request. So it's an important call from industry, but I also want to say that we know that from the Canadian Climate Institute's work, that 2/3 of emissions reductions will be led by industry in this country. So 2/3, that's 66% of all of the emissions reductions in this country will be led by industry. It's found that industrial carbon pricing is the top driver of emissions reductions between now and 2030, that industrial carbon pricing will do more than any other policy to cut Canada's emissions. The large emitter trading system that is in place already is the single biggest driver of emissions reductions. I will note that recently the Journal of Science published an article that was a very in-depth study. It's probably the most comprehensive study being done on climate policies and the intersection of those policies, the mixture of those policies. And they looked at 1,500 different policies across 43 jurisdictions around the world, looked at 20 years worth of data, and they were able to isolate and show that the most successful policy mixtures for emissions reductions included carbon pricing or pricing instruments and mechanisms, as well as incentives and regulation, which I would say Canada has all three, which is a good thing. So we have the right policy mixture in Canada, but we have this misalignment across provinces and territories in terms of the system that we have. And so I think we need to work together to figure out a path for, addressing the concerns that our industry, associations and representatives are asking us to look at. And I think, this has, what hangs in the balance here is really how fast we can decarbonize. It's how much we can mitigate the risks of climate change as we move forward, which are very, very costly, as we know. Just this year, it's estimated that there will be $25 billion in damages and losses due to climate change, which is half of projected GDP growth. That's not insignificant. Imagine half of our projected GDP growth will be going to just afford the costs of the damages of climate change, the productivity losses. So there's significant impact here that I think we need to be aware of. We can't, put our hands over our eyes and pretend this is going to go away. It's not. And I really think that this committee can do some deeper dive work on a study. We're saying at least no less than 2 meetings. I honestly think this would require more than 2 meetings, of course, and I would be happy to study it for longer. So maybe I'll speak more to this if we have more time for debate on this, which I imagine we might, but we'll see what the other committee members have to say about this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turnbull. And just so that we're clear, members, in the excitement, I think I had the wrong motion circulated, the one that Mr. Turnbull had given notice for, but this one is from the floor, and it's been circulated via email by the clerk. So now we're talking about the motion that Mr. Turnbull's just moved. And before we enter this discussion, I just want to reiterate the list that I have after we've dealt with this motion. I've got Mr. Perkins, and then I've got Mr. Savard-Tremblay, Mr. Massé, and then Mr. Patzer, because I saw all the hands go up more or less at the same time, so I'm going by party. I think that's going to make it easier. So, but now we're on the motion by Mr. Turnbull. Do I have any comments? Mr. Massé.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the motion coming forward. I guess what I'm trying to figure out as we go through several of these motions here, what it means to our current schedule with regards to the credit card study, and then getting it actually, hopefully, I was hopeful that, and maybe this is a little bit too optimistic, we might have a chance to either have a report before we break or table something if there was actually the time, if we gave direct discussion points to our analysts, or that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out, is how do we go through this trifecta of suggestions on work that we do without knowing our calendar. So I don't want to end up in a situation where we do not end up finishing the work that we wanted to get done. So that's kind of how I'm trying to figure out right now as we go through this. So I'm not opposed to the motion. And I'm open to doing other things, but just trying to figure out. And then lastly, I think this is a really important part of it, is where the hell is the amendments from the government on C-27? All I get is commentary from the minister in the public domain, or having to answer interviews. And I think at some point I might have a motion to pull the minister here specifically for that issue, because it was promised that we were going to get these amendments. They weren't even amendments if we go back in time. And then we still don't know where that is. So I don't know how we actually deal with all these things, because we don't even know what the intent of the government is on him publicly saying here he had amendments, and publicly saying to us, and talking to us privately, that we're getting something, but we still don't have it here. So if the government's real intention is that they've run up the white flag on C-27 in terms of all the work, I still thought there was some commitment to get the privacy stuff done. And I have legislation that would split it in the House of Commons ready. As all parties know, we've even discussed that before, so we could actually get a piece of work to the Senate if there was compromise, but we don't even know what that is. So the government has another motion right now on committee business, and they still have not brought these other amendments on legislation. So I'm just trying to figure out, how do we prioritize all these things? And if we knew exactly what the plan was from the government, then maybe that would help.
Mr. Massé, I'll just share my 2 cents on this. Reading the motion, it has no hard timeline, so our schedule is pretty packed until the end of the session, until the holiday break. So I agree with you on the credit card. I'd like to get it, once we're done, I'd like to finish our report and submit it. I don't want it to linger in a no man's land for too long. But that said, it's got no timeline, so at this point we're just putting potential studies on the docket. Oh yes, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I echo the comments of MP Massey in that, we all know, and I'll say it here, that the minister had conversations with everybody when the House came back saying, what do we got to do to get C-27 through? We, at least on, I think the 3 opposition parties all made it very clear what it would take, and the minister did pledge to go back and do that. And then he's been yammering in the media about how the committee's blocking everything. The committee isn't blocking anything, because the minister, once again, hasn't lived up to his commitments and come back with the changes to the tribunal and the AI portion of the bill that we all required in order to proceed. So it would be good if he would come here. I would support a motion by MP Massey if to recall the minister to ask him what the heck he's doing. With regard to this motion, of course, I agree, Mr. Chair, that a lot of things we're doing, that the House has ordered us to do a study on the potential anti-competitive nature of the e-transfer and broader economics payment system in the banking system that causes Canadians to pay what appears to be way too much money for their financial services. And but on this particular motion, I do agree that a study on the Liberal government's carbon tax, a carbon tax on everything, a carbon tax that has put the price up of everything, a carbon tax that the government claims reduces carbon emissions, yet their own environment department doesn't even monitor its impact. So it has no impact, since it's so important to the government that the radical Liberal environment minister doesn't even bother to try and monitor its impacts. So yeah, I think it would be great to have a study on this. But my problem with this motion that MP Turnbull put forward is he actually wrote the report in the preamble before setting up the study and made a bunch of conclusions. So I would propose the following amendment to Mr. Turnbull's committee study: to delete everything from the first word given until the last sentence. And that last sentence, of course, begins that the committee allocate no less than 2 meetings to study the topic of the industrial carbon pricing. But what I will do is amend that line to say that the committee allocate no less than 2 meetings to study the matter of industrial and consumer carbon pricing, and that these meetings begin following the appearance, no, this is wrong, following, that the committee allocate no less than 2 meetings to this matter on the industrial and consumer carbon pricing, and that these meetings begin once the committee has set its schedule and figures out an appropriate timing.
Okay, so we've got an amendment on the floor by Mr. Perkins. So essentially, it would be removing everything before that the committee allocate, and include industrial and consumer carbon pricing. So on the amendment, Mr. Turnbull.
Attendez juste un instant avec l'interprétation. C'est un peu,
One moment. It's hard to follow. There's the interpretation that I have to listen to. It's a bit difficult to follow, so I just want to make sure if you could I could just repeat in French what Mr. Perkins is proposing is that all the statements be withdrawn, i.e. given that, and that we make do with the committee dedicate at least 2 meetings for the study on the industrial concerns of aspects of carbon. It's really a bit of a free translation that I'm giving you right now, but the impact that would have on consumers, and that this study begin when we will have completed everything currently on the agenda. So we should remove all the givens that. Yes, everything that precedes that the committee dedicate 2 meetings would be dropped. Thank you very much, Mr. Savard-Tremblay.
So it seems like Conservatives are all talk then, because they sound like they want to study carbon pricing and are against it, as usual, which is fine, but want to delay it as long as possible. So they're actually scared to study it. Mr. Perkins has suggested that I presupposed where the study was going to land, and I didn't do that. I actually referenced the most, I would say, significant piece of scientific research that has ever been done on climate policies that show that carbon pricing and pricing instruments in general work in combination with other policies as a mixture to bring down carbon emissions quickly. So to me, that's, I mean, I can quote directly from the article if Mr. Perkins would like, but maybe he's suggesting that I don't have the right to take the floor and motivate a motion that I'm moving in committee. I don't see how that is relevant here, given the fact that the Conservatives do that in every time that they move a motion. So why would that not be? Why would I not be afforded the same right and privilege to speak to a motion that I put on the floor? So I just find it strange that they want to gut this motion and don't actually want to study carbon pricing. I find it kind of strange given how much time they spend talking about it in the House of Commons. So it's a little bit strange. The other thing is that our industry is asking us to do this. So isn't this committee supposed to study things that are relevant to industry? If industry associations, even in the prairie provinces, which I know some of the members across the way come from, want us to study this and look at this as a major issue that they have. They're aligned, asking us to look at the challenges and essentially look at how we can fix the interjurisdictional challenges that they experience, those sort of misalignments that create problems for them within their operations. We want a more competitive industry. They're saying that carbon pricing is what helps them be competitive. So I don't know why the Conservatives would be against this. It seems to me to be a study that we should all be aligned on. I know the NDP has backed down quite a bit from carbon pricing in general and said that they're against the carbon tax, but they certainly are not against. I haven't heard them say that they're against the industrial carbon pricing system that we have. In fact, I think that Mr. Massey and his party, the NDP, are for carbon pricing. I think they always have been, even though they've backed down from the consumer-facing portion of it. We know that they've been supportive, and I know that within the circles of very progressive-minded people in this country, that the NDP have often cited their leadership on climate change and wanting to raise ambition. It would strike me as very strange that they would vote against a motion or oppose a motion that would support us looking at how our industry can be more competitive and decarbonize faster. So I don't understand how this could be a major contentious issue here, to study this in detail. And the preamble that's in here is really referencing most of what I think is significant about what the rationale for bringing this particular study up at this moment is. And I think that those elements of the motion should stay in. So I would respectfully say that I would be voting against Mr. Perkins' attempt to gut this motion because he's scared to study carbon pricing.
Thank you. I have Mr. Patzern and Mr. Perkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Turnbull, for admitting that you didn't pay any attention to what Mr. Perkins said when he put his amendment forward, because he did say that he wanted to include the consumer carbon tax in this motion. So, in fact, he was expanding the scope to include it. So your assertion that we don't want to talk about it is actually wrong. So thank you for putting it on the record that you weren't paying any attention. I appreciate that. I also appreciate how previously you put it on the record publicly that consumers were going to face some significant pain because of your carbon tax. You admitted in public that people were going to have to pay up and it was going to hurt. Those were your own words. So you were very clear about that, and that is exactly what we are seeing all across the country, is that people are in a lot of pain because of the economic ruin that you have imposed upon this country. So I think that's abundantly clear. So, I mean, that's why we would like to include the consumer carbon tax into this motion as well. So, but I mean, those are your own words. Those were your own words saying that people were going to experience a lot of pain. So is that the economic... let's see here. What was the words that you used? The economic certainty. Was that what it was? The economic certainty was that people are going to feel pain. Is that what you were meaning? I wonder. So, and then there's the element of dealing with the preamble as well. So, I mean, you've thrown in all these hand-picked statistics and different things like that. You're trying to kind of set the tone for what you want the study to look like, and it's all speculative, because the key word there is given that it could lead. So that's kind of what you're insinuating, is that it could lead to this. Now, there's other factors at play here, of course. You know, you look at the dollar values you've assigned to it. Well, your government's failed on getting a softwood lumber agreement for 9 years. That's had a substantive impact on the cost of building materials in this country. There are many other factors that have impacted the cost of building in this country, including your consumer carbon tax being a huge factor in that. So there's many factors that are at play here. So if you want to have a real conversation about it, let's look at all of it. There's so much more to it than just simply saying that, oh, climate change could cause $35 billion per year by 2030. Well, if your government had actually done its job over the last 9 years, I'll bet you that number would be nowhere near as high. And that includes everything from trade policy to economic development, respecting provincial jurisdiction, allowing the provinces, allowing industry to do what they do best. But you've stepped in the way every single time to get in the way of that. I'm on the Natural Resources Committee. We're doing a study on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And we had the PBO come, and we've had other witnesses come, and they've said that government policy is going to have a direct impact on what someone's going to be willing to pay to buy the pipeline because of the lack of certainty that has been put in place. And when you look at the conditions that are in place, why would anybody want to buy that pipeline when it's going to be almost impossible to have any new development in this country and get anything done? So that's the record that your government has, Mr. Turnbull, when it comes to handling the economy and the economic and social incentive, as you like to put here. So, you know, when we talk to people, whether it's in meetings, whether it's when you go out on the road in our ridings, and we tour around business, they talk a lot about the number one threat to them in my riding, which is an agricultural and energy producing region of the country. It's not climate change that they bring up. It's government policy that they say is the biggest threat to them. So I would love to talk about the threat that government policy has been to these businesses, because they tell me on a regular basis how devastating and how hard it is to deal with trying to grow and expand their business, let alone just keep the doors open because of bad government policy that's been put forward by you and your government. So, I mean, if that's what you want to brag on, I would love to hear it, and I would be more than happy to put those people's voices into the record during this study about the economic ruin that you have provided for business in Cypress Hills grasslands and all across this country.
Merci, Monsieur Patzer. Je rappelle qu'on est sur l'amendement. J'ai
I'll
Monsieur...
remind folks that we're dealing with the amendment.
Monsieur Perkins? No? Monsieur Turnbull?
Sure. So I'd like to make a couple more points. I think what's interesting is we had the food professor here, Sylvain Charlebois. I remember very specifically, and I will quote the fact that he said when he was here, that for those who have agricultural producing regions, my region is Durham region, we actually do produce a lot of agricultural goods and products. And so I know that farmers are definitely concerned about climate change. I know that Sylvain Charlebois actually came here and said that climate change is actually the biggest challenge that our agri-food industry faces and that we need to address it. That's a direct quote. So, you know, if the guy that the Conservatives like to quote all the time is saying that climate change is actually the biggest challenge that our agri-food industry has, then why wouldn't you want to study the impacts of climate change and understand how we can help ensure that our agricultural industry and our producers that we all value can continue to feed Canada and the world and prosper in the future. So it seems a little strange to me that that the Conservatives would want to take that part out, the specific reference to the industries that were in the motion. Anyway, so I could say more about that, but I'll just say that it seems a little strange when, you know, farmers are at the front lines of the impacts of climate change, as we know, and we've heard this. I was on the Agri-Food Standing Committee for quite a while, and we heard about this as being a major concern for our food producers across Canada. And I know Agri-Food Canada projected net revenue losses of 49.2% in 2023 for Quebec farmers and 86.5% in 2024. I referenced that when Mr. Charlebois was here, he agreed that the costs of climate change were real, that they were very concerning, and that we needed to address it. He certainly disagreed with some portions of how to address it. I will say that, but he definitely agreed that that this was a major threat to the agri-food industry. I also wanted to mention, Mr. Patzer said something about trade policy, and I think that's another major consideration here, where you have Canada is the second largest, the EU is Canada's second largest trading partner after the U.S., accounting for more than $180 billion in bilateral trade in 2023. And they have carbon border adjustments that will come into effect in 2026, which means all of our exports will be subjected to tariffs if we don't sort of abide by the same standard and bring ourselves up to the standard that they've set. So more than 70% of Canada's exports are either a variety of fossil fuels or goods resulting from emissions-intensive trade-exposed sectors. We're talking about energy, transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture. And Canada's most trade-exposed sectors are iron and steel. So that's pretty significant when you think about the kinds of things that I think should appeal to all of us in our respective jurisdictions, the ridings that we represent, that those industries are parts of the backbone of our economy, and we should all be concerned with the fact that they're trade exposed in the European market as those carbon border adjustment mechanisms come into force in 2026. I'll also just mention quickly that there are labor market impacts, and I noticed that Mr. Perkins, when he proposed to gut this motion and take everything out of it, he's taking out the specific references to labor markets. Those are real jobs, employment, and wages for our workers, and in particular, the most vulnerable workers in Canada, who I think would be most exposed to the risks of climate change, the natural disasters that affect their ability to go to work every day. And we know that we've had conversations about climate justice. I know the Conservatives don't even believe in climate change, so they don't really participate in these conversations very often. But we know that the most vulnerable people in Canada who would be most exposed to the risks of climate change or the impacts of climate change are often the people who are already the most vulnerable and live in the areas that, through no fault of their own, would be impacted by the damages done by climate change. So, for example, the Climate Institute finds that all households will lose income due to climate change. Low-income households will suffer the most. Low-income households could see income losses of 19% in high-emission scenarios by the end of this century. So climate change is a job killer. It leads to job losses that could double by mid-century and increase to 2.9 million by the end of the century. That's a really significant amount of job losses in this country for those of us who care about Canadians' jobs or pretend to care. I hope most of us actually do care, but it seems strange to me that the Conservatives would rip out that portion of the motion because they're not interested in understanding the impacts on labor markets and real people's jobs. So, perhaps I'll leave it there for the moment, Chair, but I just wanted to add those points to my arguments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turnbull. As a reminder, colleagues, we're on the amendment of Mr. Perkins. I have on my list Brian Massé and Mme Rempel-Garner. Mr. Massé.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the past, I've tried to see if we could amend things to get them passed here and get them done. I'm going to look at this, and the same line and a couple words to that is that perhaps if we concluded the first line, that given the governments have an economic and social incentive to act on climate change, and then move to the final line that the committee allocate no less than 2 meetings to study the topic of industrial carbon and so forth, they would get rid of some of the things in there that are causing some of the debate. And even one of those in there right now with the Liberal Party saying that climate change could lead to devastating impacts, I would argue it has led to, I could get into that. Or I could add a line like, given the Liberal Party of Canada as government made the single largest economic investment in carbon pollution and buying a leaky pipeline that continues to expand emissions, increase debt, and free market manipulation. I mean, I could do that kind of stuff too. So I'm trying to figure out here whether if there's actually a sincere interest to try to see if we're doing it. So I would suggest if we could keep the first line in and get the specifics of the other stuff out that we could raise during testimony and the witnesses that are here, whether that would get us off at the point where we could actually get this done.
Yeah, I'm afraid, Mr. Massey, we would probably have to deal with the amendment first. I'm not sure that this is...
Okay.
Well...
Trying.
Like putting stuff back that's been removed in an amendment, it's not the most elegant way of doing things. I would suggest maybe, Mr. Massey, we deal with the amendment and you can bring it back if it's not adopted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I
Thank you. I'm
appreciate
sorry to the interpreters speaking too fast.
Yes, I have Madam Rempel.
Just a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Perkins.
The chair could seek UC, could he not, to do what Mr. Massey suggested?
Everything is possible with unanimous consent. So there is unanimous consent. So Mr. Massey, maybe propose it again. Thank you, Mr. Perkins.
Thank
A
you.
useful vice chair.
Yes, thank you. And it would just be that we'd have Mr. Turnbull's motion as it stands here, given that the governments have an economic and social incentive to act on climate change, and then move down to the final paragraph that the committee allocate no less than 2 meetings to study the topic of industrial carbon pricing as well as a broader industrial and labor market impacts of climate change.
Including paragraph I had, you mean?
Yeah, yes.
So the concluding paragraph, Mr. Perkins had modified to include consumers.
Yeah, that's
and
fine.
had given some sort of timeline that we would start the study after we are done with what's currently scheduled. So we would keep the last paragraph as Mr. Perkins had suggested, but basically just keep the first sentence. Yeah. Okay, do we have unanimous consent for that proposition by Mr. I don't see unanimous consent, unfortunately, Mr. Massey, which takes us back to the amendment as it stands, and I have Madam Rempel Garner.
So, Chair, my understanding is that my Conservative colleague, Mr. Perkins, has moved the following. That the committee allocate no less than 2 meetings to study the matter of industrial and consumer carbon pricing. I mean, this sounds like a very reasonable motion. I think that a lot of Canadians care about ensuring that the government addresses climate change in a meaningful way, but also in a way that doesn't make life unaffordable for them. And what I'm hearing, it shocks me today that my Liberal colleagues would vote against this motion. I don't know why they would vote against that unless they don't care about climate change or making life more affordable for people. I think a lot of Canadians would be shocked to see how the Liberal Party, when they think nobody is looking, would vote against a motion to study industrial and consumer carbon pricing. But we'll make sure that people see how they vote on this motion. Thank you.
Just to correct an amendment that we're debating the amendment by Mr. Perkins, not the motion. So just to be clear with everyone, Mr. Turnbull.
Yeah, I appreciate the attempt that Mr. Rempel Garner has made about. I appreciate her attempt to sort of contort this into something that we're voting against, but this is clearly an amendment designed to gut and take out the industrial and the labor market portion with specific references to the rationale and motivation for bringing this motion forward. So I don't support that. I don't think that it adds any value to take all of the substantive stuff out of it. To be honest with you, I really think that the Conservative members seem to want to take out energy, forestry, mining, agriculture, fisheries, all of which I think are industries that they should care about. That's why we specifically made reference to those. We figured you would want to understand the impacts of both climate change and industrial carbon pricing in particular on the competitiveness of those industries. And so, purposely designing it that way was designed to bring you into the conversation and have you hopefully support what I think is a strong rationale for a good motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Do I have any other speakers on my list? Est-ce que j'ai d'autres orateurs? Non.
Any other speakers on my list? Seeing none, we can move on to the vote on Mr. Savard-Tremblay. You wanted to speak? We're voting on the amendment. Madam Clerk, please.
Mr. Perkins, Mr. Turnbull,
Oppose.
Mr. Arias. No. Mr. Badaway. Mr. Gahir.
Oppose.
Mr. Kuzmerchuk.
Oppose.
Mr. Perkins.
Always support amendments like that.
Monsieur Généreux.
Oui.
Mr. Patzer.
Yes.
Ms. Rempel-Gardner.
Yes.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Contre.
And Mr. Massey.
No.
Donc l'amendement est rejeté, ce qui nous
The
ramène.
amendment is defeated. That brings us back to the initial motion moved by Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Massey.
The main motion, after the pricing system in the main motion, that we add the following: given the Liberal Party of Canada as government made the single largest economic investment in carbon pollution, buying a leaky pipeline that continues to expand emissions, increase debt for the public, and free market manipulation.
Okay, would it be possible, Mr. Massey, to send it or have someone in your
I'll
staff
work on that
send it
right away.
to the clerk? It'll be circulated. So there's an amendment on the floor. You've all heard it. Well, we have any comments on this amendment, or should I put it straight to a vote? I will put it straight to a vote, seeing that no one wants to comment on that. So, Madame la Greffière, on the amendment by Mr. Massey.
Mr. Turnbull.
Opposed.
Mr. Arias. No. Mr. Badaway. Mr. Gahir.
Oppose.
Mr. Kuzmerchuk.
Oppose.
Mr. Perkins. Mr. Généreux.
Oppose.
Mr. Patzer.
No.
Ms. Rempel-Gardner. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
En faveur.
Mr. Massey.
Oui.
Alors, l'amendement est défait, ce qui nous ramène
The amendment
à...
is defeated. This brings us once again back to Mr. Turnbull's motion. Are there any speakers on the list? Mr. Savard-Tremblay. I just want to point out that this study is extremely important. Now, having said that, I'm going to oppose it for a simple reason, and that is this is an extremely important topic. We heard what the European Union intends to do in this regard. We shouldn't just have two meetings in the middle of the study on C27 to deal with this. To my mind, that speaks to extreme negligence. This is an issue that needs to be gone over with a fine-tooth comb, and in the face of this motion, I would oppose it. Thank you, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. Ms. Rempel-Gardner on the motion.
Go back to what my colleague Mr. Massey had suggested, and I'll formally move the amendment that he suggested, which is to strike all of the words after the first paragraph. So strike starting with the word given, that climate change could, etc. And then keep the last paragraph that the committee allocate no less than 2 meetings to the study of industrial carbon pricing. So keep that, but add the word and consumer carbon pricing to that paragraph.
Okay, so we have an amendment on the floor, which is essentially what Mr. Massey had proposed, where he sought unanimous consent, which would be to keep the first sentence, given the government have an economic and social incentive to act on climate change. Correct me if I'm wrong, MP Rempel-Gardner. Then strike the rest and keep the last paragraph, adding consumers' carbon pricing. Do I have any comments on the amendment proposed by MP Rempel-Gardner? Mr. Turnbull.
Maybe I misunderstood or didn't follow, but I think this is exactly what Mr. Massey had suggested, but I would like to see it in writing if possible, just because I think it takes out everything. So substantively, I think it takes out almost everything. So didn't we already vote on this? And that's one of the
order, Chair.
rules that I know in terms of the standing orders. Once a committee has substantively dealt with an issue, that you can't
Point of order, Chair.
reintroduce it and call a vote on it,
Just
but
one
I'd like to
second,
see it
Member
in
Turnbull.
writing.
There is a point of order.
Point of order,
Didn't
Chair.
I have the floor?
No, you have a
point of order
precedence.
takes
Well,
I'll
cite
yield
the
the floor
standing
back
order.
to you once I've dealt with the point of order. Thank you,
Point of
Mr.
order,
Turnbull.
Chair. A motion, there was no motion moved. It was a request for unanimous consent, which was denied.
Yes, thank you, MP Rempel Garner, but I'm addressing this with Mr. Turnbull right now. Basically, it's a point of order you're raising, Mr. Turnbull, if I'm not mistaken. You're saying we've already dealt with this issue. However, I've debated it internally when I heard MP Rempel Garner present it, because it is very close to the amendment that Mr. Perkins presented and on which we just voted and which was rejected. But it is not exactly the same. I'm just going to take 1 second with the clerk to see if she can enlighten me. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I sought and got validation from the clerk that basically there is a difference in the amendment, and what Mr. Perkins had suggested, what Mr. Massey had suggested, he sought unanimous consent, so he didn't move it as an amendment. So we're back to almost square one with the amendment by MP Rempel Garner. Are there any speakers to that? Mr. Turnbull.
Could I ask for it in writing in both official languages and then have a very brief suspension for just a couple of minutes to just consider this, if you don't mind?
Granted, very brief suspension the time it's sent. So I'll suspend for a minute or two once it's there. Ça a été...
Colleagues, the amendment from Ms. Rempel-Garner has been distributed in both official languages. So we'll pick up where we left off on the amendment discussion. Do I have any speakers about Ms. Rempel-Garner's motion?
To Ms. Rempel-Garner's amendment, and I think it might get us to a place where we can all agree on this motion and get a vote done. So what I propose would be very similar to what Mr. Massey proposed, but I'm just adding back in part of the language on labor markets because I feel the impact on labor markets is particularly important. So given that governments have an economic and social incentive to act on climate change, and given it leads to impacts on labor markets, employment, and wage growth, particularly in the absence of climate action, and that the committee allocate no less than 2 meetings to study the topic of industrial carbon pricing, as well as broader industrial and labor market impacts of climate change. So I think... No, actually, if you want to add that back in, that's an oversight on my part. So it's an oversight on my part. I don't have any problem with studying.
Okay, so the last, so that the committee allocate no less than 2 meetings to the topic of industrial and consumer carbon pricing.
Yeah,
that stays as is, as proposed by Madame Rempel-Garner. Basically, you're just adding, and given it leads to impacts on labor markets, employment, wage growth, particularly in the absence of carbon action. Climate action,
yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's the sub-amendment proposed by Mr. Perkins to Madame Rempel-Garner. Sorry, guys, it's still early, and you're. So okay, Mr. Turnbull, we've heard the terms of the sub-amendment proposed by Mr. Turnbull. Any comments on the sub-amendment proposed by MP Turnbull to MP Rempel-Garner's amendment? No? Is it clear to everyone what's been proposed by Mr. Turnbull? Okay.
We don't need a break.
So no. So okay, good. So okay. So I'll put it. So we'll put it to a vote. C'est clair pour tout le monde, Monsieur Savard-Tremblay. Vous avez bien
Mr.
entendu.
Savard-Tremblay, did you hear what's going on? I know that with the interpretation it's sometimes difficult. No, I'm okay. I'm just rereading it right now. There's a mistake in the translation. It says industrial and consumer carbon pricing. Yes, we're going to work on that detail afterwards, says the chair. But as far as the rest of the motion is concerned, that's fine. We're dealing with Turnbull's sub-amendment, and let's vote on that, given that there are no other speakers on my list. Madam Clerk.
Mr. Turnbull.
Yes, support.
Mr. Ariam. Yes. Mr. Badaway. Yes. Mr. Gahir.
Yes.
Mr. Kuzmirchuk.
Support.
Mr. Perkins.
Yes.
Mr. Genereux.
Oui.
Mr. Patzer.
Yes.
Ms. Rempel-Garner.
Yes.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Oui.
Mr. Massey.
Yes. Wow. Okay. Bon, mais je m'excuse. C'est rare. No, usually.
Sorry.
I'm glad to see we've got unanimous consent on the sub-amendment proposed by Mr. Turnbull, which brings us to back to the amendment. But at this point, colleagues, if we've agreed to this sub-amendment unanimously, I'm guessing we're agreeing on the motion as amended by the sub-amendment. So I think we can proceed that way. I've got UC to say that it's adopted. Yeah. Amazing. In an hour. Great. Thank you, which gives us 1 more hour. And I had on my list Mr. Perkins.
Yes, I have had a motion on notice. I'm just trying to find it here in my package with regard to Telesat. We had some testimony on Telesat. Can you? It's a lot. Sorry. Can you hang on just a sec? Which page? Just show it.
Give him a recess,
Mr. Perkins, do you want us to suspend briefly? No? Okay.
Mr. Chair. So given that the recent evidence that we had suggesting that research, sorry. 1 minute, please. You gave me the housing one. It wasn't even my motion. That in relation to the Government of Canada's recent $2.1 billion loan to Telesat, that the committee agreed to hold 2 meetings examining the feasibility and business case justifying the deal. Over 2 meetings, the current motion says within 14 days. We'll have to amend that, but I'll read it in now because that's what's on motion. Within the adoption of this motion, and the committee agreed to invite the following witnesses: Francis Bilodeau, Acting Deputy Minister of ISED, the Industry Department, and B. Daniel Goldberg, the CEO of Telesat.
So the Telesat motion, I just, 1 second, I think we have it printed here. It is somewhere, but it was given notice. So, Mr. Perkins, do you have anything to add on this, or do we start the debate right now?
I will just say that we had quite questionable testimony from the minister, who didn't seem to understand the deal and the terms of the deal of the $2.1 billion that he had signed in a loan to Telesat, which is a company that's at least 63% owned by American hedge funds. The minister didn't seem to understand that fact, and neither did the department. I don't think they had done their homework to put up 198 satellites at a cost of somewhere between $10 to $20 million a satellite. This is quite a huge commitment from the Government of Canada to be subsidizing an American firm that has had failing revenue, whose interest costs will now equate to about 2/3 of the revenue that this company has just on the debt when you include this loan. So I believe that it is our responsibility of members of the Industry Committee to look into a bailout of American companies that this industry minister has tried to do.
Thank you. So I have Brian Massey on the.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do support this motion, and I just want to follow up with regards to my previous comments as we try to work our way through our different evidence here. And we have still not heard from the parliamentary secretary or anybody about the intentions of the government on C-27. So I was considering drafting a motion for you as chair to ask the minister specifically, but at the same time, I'm figuring out at this point, just assume it's been abandoned. Because why create more work for ourselves when we have other things that we can look at that are important to Canadians like this? There's been significant issues in Telesat that have come up, as well as other things. So with that, I'm not going to propose you writing a letter to the minister to find out what he's doing, because I can only assume the behavior that is conducted in public is really representative of what he sends his members here to do, and that's basically to abandon legislation. And, you know, committee in the past, we've abandoned our own studies and other things to focus on legislation. And I want to remind everyone here that it was the last 2 sessions where Liberal members were filibustering the committee by speaking through the time frames and timelines because they didn't know what to do about the tribunal. So we have a number of different organizations, companies that are asking us on a regular basis, on civil society, to even just yesterday I had another telecommunications lobby to me asking what's going on in C-27, and basically can only respond to what the minister is saying in public. And so I guess we move on at this point, and if they're not going to prepare to this meeting to tell us what their objectives are on this, we need to set our schedule and move ahead. And it's entirely their fault on this because we have set aside time and we have not heard anything back. So that's kind of where I'm at. So I'll support this because we do have some time that we will have once we get other things done, and I'm operating hopefully that we can clear the deck with the stuff that we've already done on that. So for those reasons, I'll support motions that'll occupy our time, because if not, then we're just going to miss opportunities to look at very important matters. And this is one that's been raised not only just by the Conservative Party, but others with regards to it and Telesat. And so I'll support it based on that. But again, I'll just close with saying it's just, again, I was going to ask you to write up, we've done this before, unanimous consent to have the chair look at it, but what's the point? They see all this, they have their members in the room here, they have their people from their party lobby system, and they really don't give a damn, I guess, at the end of the day. So we'll just move ahead at this point in time.
Merci, Monsieur Massé. J'ai Monsieur Turnbull, suivi de
Mr.
Monsieur...
Turnbull, followed by Mr. Généreux, then one more speaker.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to all the committee members for a good, productive meeting. I'm glad we got that last motion passed with some consensus building. I would propose to amend this and take out within 14 days. So it would read, basically everything would stay the same, except we'd be deleting within 14 days following the adoption of this motion. And if you just take that out, then I think we would be prepared to support it. The background for this is obviously it's a loan to Telesat. I think that the loan is structured and the nature of the industry of putting up satellites into space is a complex one that you've got to understand the business model and the amount of time that takes to understand the structure of a loan that would support an industry like that. And it's unique. So I think it would be a good opportunity for us to understand that a bit better and hopefully educate the Conservatives because they don't seem to get that.
Merci, Monsieur Turnbull. J'ai Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Généreux, the floor is yours.
Je proposerai un
Mr. Chair, I'd propose a sub-amendment to Mr. Turnbull's amendment, and I agree with the 14 days, but that the study would be done in a period of 2 meetings after the study on behaviour and e-transfer e-system. We got a memo from the House of Commons that we should study that and the other study should come thereafter. Well, it goes without saying that regardless of the motion we passed, it doesn't take precedence on the schedule that we've already set up for December. Therefore, our current calendar needs to be in response to the order from the House. It won't take precedence, what you're saying, but just to remind colleagues, we have an amendment proposed by Mr. Turnbull, and that is to delete within 14 days following the adoption of this motion. Now, on the amendment, any comments on the amendment?
Well, Mr. Généreux proposed a sub-amendment to the amendment. I've just explained to Mr. Généreux, we're not going to change the schedule for this motion. We have an order from the House to study anti-competitive behaviors, which is taking us until Christmas. So,
point of order?
Yes.
So, Mr. Généreux's sub-amendment proposes a time which is in order, and that time is after the study, as he said.
Right after.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Monsieur Généreux, j'avais mal compris. Donc, right after. Okay. So the sub-amendment is right after the anti-competitive ecosystem that we have. So, on the sub-amendment, do I have any speakers, Mr. Massé?
So what does that do with all of our other business, though, including our current study?
Including our?
Yeah, current study.
Well,
so, I'm not sure when we start the stuff in the House and when that finishes, and if that goes right after that, that means if we can't even have one meeting to finish anything else that we need on our study, I'm just wondering.
Well, on credit card, from my understanding, we've already had the meetings that we had agreed to in the motion, and then some. So we would need some time just for the drafting instructions and the report. But I think that can be managed. Maybe. If needs be through additional resources, but otherwise, just sometimes when we have scheduling issues, we can squeeze in a meeting to analyze the report, which has to be written by the analysts as well. So we've got a bit of time on that, Mr. Massé.
Okay, because that's my only concern is just locking this out of any flexibility to do.
Understood.
And I don't think that's the intention of the mover on that either. It's just I don't want us to get into that bind.
Okay, so just to get back in the interest of trying to speed things up, we've got Mr. Turnbull proposed to remove the within 14 days, and Mr. Généreux is sub-amending that to just say right after the current study on credit cards and anti-competitive behavior. Do I have any comments on that specific amendment? On that amendment, Mr. Turnbull? Sub-amendment, sorry.
Well, we had hoped that obviously that we would be back on C27 after that particular study. So I know that Mr. Massey is asking questions about that, and we've been working very diligently to come up with options to get back to C27. So I think if that's a priority for a number of individuals, then to me that would be the preference when we get back after the study that Mr. Généreux had mentioned, which I think we've now clarified as the order from the House. Right, that we need to study
right after the order from the House.
Yeah, so because he's adding right after that, so that would suggest that the committee don't. So I think I would respectfully oppose that because I would like to be back on C27 immediately following that.
And to be clear, this is all in January when we come back, because we're not getting there this session. On the sub-amendment by Mr. Généreux, Monsieur Généreux.
En fait, essentiellement.
Well, in fact, I don't share my colleague's opinion. We're talking about 2 meetings, and I don't think 2 meetings will make a big difference as far as C27 is concerned. So I guess it's important to do this study when we get back in January or February, that is. There might just be 1 meeting in January, and so I don't think this will change our schedule when it comes to C27, and the Minister hasn't responded to our requests and the proposed amendments regarding C27. There's no planning in terms of C27. Now, on the sub-amendment, Mr. Généreux's sub-amendment, any speakers? Mr. Arias, Mr. Massey.
On this sub-amendment, Mr. Chair, my preference would be to deal with C27, and I'll talk on this motion later, but on the sub-amendment, my preference is to deal with C27 at the earliest.
Monsieur Massey?
Well, I mean, I started this meeting raising this exact point, and maybe we could get from the clerk the exact timeline the Liberals broke off C27, so we can maybe take a recess to find out whether or not, I don't know, it's been 4 months maybe. We've been waiting for these amendments. I'd like to know specifically how many months it is, because magically they seem to be able to kind of suggest to us that they're going to have amendments within a few weeks, even though I specifically asked that over and over. And now we're getting the Liberals opposing a specific thing that we have to work on today for our calendar, because now they say that the amendments are going to come after being quiet about it all meeting, and we have to do our planning. And here we are back again, and I think it's got to be 4 months. I'm just going off. I'm going off the top of my head in terms of remembering when we broke off C27 and we were promised all these different things. So I don't even know how I'm supposed to even really, like, Mr. Généreux offered an amendment on us to do something, and then we're supposed to, I guess, have some faith here that we're going to get some amendments and hold up from, and I think the ministers, when he came here, and he didn't even have amendments, he had ideas, and then finally we got them into amendments, and that took about a year, I think it was, and now we're supposed to actually scuttle all our planning on this meeting. Maybe we should recess the meeting, and maybe I should bring back the motion for you to actually find out from the minister specifically. I'd actually, at this point, too, like to know why it's taken so long. Like, it's, this is the challenge that we have, because I think that the member's making a legitimate motion here that is important, and then when we're supposed to now disregard it, I don't understand the logic on the other side here. I really don't. So I'm going to support them. I'm going to support the sub-amendment, I guess, based upon all things, because I'm not going to wait for this unicorn to pop up with regards to the, having the amendments written for us, and we're supposed to put all our lives on hold again. So
Well, I hope you don't put your life on hold for C27, Mr. Massey. Certainly hope. Okay, thank.
I'd rather just get on with stuff. You know, even last motion, I was glad that Ms. Rempel Gardner brought back the compromise that we had so we can get stuff done and moving along, but we can't when we've got this kind of stuff going on.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. You've been heard, Mr. No, I have. So on the sub-amendment still, I have MP Rempel Gardner.
To echo Mr. Massey's comments, I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, there's amendments coming. It's like, come on. I mean, if there was going to be amendments, they would have tabled amendments by now. My sense is that the minister is very busy planning his leadership bid and very busy announcing money that we don't have for other initiatives that haven't even been approved in the estimates yet. So I think the safe bet is to assume there aren't amendments. And I think the safe bet is to agree with Mr. Massey that we need to get on with planning the business of this committee. And then if the minister wants to surprise us and drop amendments today, I mean, wow, that would be something, wouldn't it? We could. We could change our schedule if that was to happen. But I think the safe bet here is that he's out on the fundraising tour trying to get ready for a leadership change, and we should move forward. Thank you.
Okay, so if I don't have any more speakers, let's put the sub-amendment to a vote. Madame la Greffière, Mr. Turnbull, did you want to speak to the sub-amendment or your...
I just wanted to say that Francis Bilodeau is not the current acting deputy minister at ISED, so...
Well, we can get back to that after the sub-amendment's been dealt with, so let's deal with the sub-amendment first. Sub-amendment, Madame la Greffière.
The sub-amendment of Mr. Turnbull.
Oppose.
Mr. Ariel. No. Mr. Badaway. Mr. Gahir.
Oppose.
Mr. Kuzmerchuk.
Oppose.
Mr. Perkins.
Support.
Mr. Generer.
Oui.
Mr. Platzer.
Yes.
Ms. Rempel Gardner.
Yes.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay.
En faveur.
Mr. Massey.
Oui.
OK, donc le sous-amendement est adopté.
The sub-amendment is carried, so that makes your amendment obsolete.
Now we've got a time frame that's outlined in the sub-amendment, which takes us back to the main motion as amended. Mr. Turnbull.
So just for accuracy, it would be good to include the deputy minister, the acting deputy minister, Philip Jennings, I believe is the right... Yeah, Philip Jennings would be the right person to actually have come as a witness.
Yep, and I think this is not consequential.
It's not acting, sorry.
So, okay, so that's, I think, a fair change. That doesn't need to be discussed. So on the main motion, do I have any more speakers on the motion? Mr. Arya.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Whenever government provides loan, it has to be of very strategic value to Canada and Canadians. I know government has stepped in throughout the history of Canadian government's system, at least during the last 20-25 years. We have seen many times government step in and support private businesses through loans, grants, and other means. Telesat is a private sector company funded by venture capitalists. So in a typical thing, if they have got a business case, commercial banks should be able to step in and fund the business. If the government is coming in and providing this huge loan of $2.1 billion, obviously I'm interested to know the reason behind it. And with that, for that, I do support this motion, that we can look into it. There's nothing to indicate that there's anything wrong in the government decision. My only thought is that we need to know more about the reasons why the government stepped in to support a private sector company. Though point has been made that the majority ownership lies with the U.S. entities, that in itself should not be an issue if there are benefits to Canada, Canadian technologies, and the implementation, whatever the project Telesat is undertaking, he is going to be in Canada, and that will stimulate technological development and add to the technological capabilities of Canada, I don't see any problem in there. However, for me to understand more detail, the reasoning behind why this loan has been given to Telesat, I would support this motion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MP Area. Do I have any more speakers on my list? So I gather from the room that there is unanimous support for the motion as amended. So if no one objects, and then I understand that the motion is adopted as amended by Mr. Généreux. Thank you very much, colleagues. And now on my list, I had MP Savard-Tremblay.
Attendez, je retrouve, j'ai moi aussi une proposition.
I also have a proposed study. It would be a very short study, and you're going to receive it by email right now. I just want to make sure you have it in both official languages. Just hold on a tick. I'll just put my finger on it. Okay, so go ahead. Do you want to wait till it's sent out? No, please proceed, and I'll read it. In any event, you'll receive it by email. But just by way of explanation, and I'll be brief, in January of this year, there were cases of 911 calls, emergency calls, from some telephones that were IP-based telephone services. And there were cases that were flagged that led to transfers to unilingual Anglophone call centres in Ontario. That could cause complications, even casualties, if emergency services aren't available in both official languages at all times. And the CRTC and Industry Minister, and I'm referring to January 2024, that there would be action taken on that file. I don't want to wait till there are deaths, casualties, fires before we take action on this file. And yet nothing's occurred. There have been no changes reported, no directives issued over the course of the summer. There were cases in our constituencies of individuals who had to come to grips with this. Should I read out the motion, or should I leave it up to members to read themselves? Okay, so here we go. So considering the users of 911 Francophone users should have access to clear, rapid service without regard to the official language, that their safety be safeguarded. Concerning the Official Languages Act, citizens should enjoy the same rights regardless of their official language, and that federal institutions are obligated to provide services fairly to all Canadians and Quebecers, given that the CRTC and the government organisation responsible for issuing regulations on IP telephony, and consequently the CRTC must address the issues that have to do with these 911 calls under a provision of the standing orders, that the committee start a study on the issues that Francophones in Quebec and minority communities face in terms of receiving a service in French when they dial 911 in emergency services, and that has to do with the place in which they find themselves, that there should be 2 meetings to hear from witnesses, and that the committee invites 1 hour per witness, the Official Languages Commissioner, the Public Safety Minister, the CRTC, the Innovation Minister, and that the committee report to the House.
Savard-Tremblay,
Thank you, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. The clerk is distributing your motion in both official languages, and that will hit everyone's email boxes in a moment. Any comments right off the bat? Mr. Généreux. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I sit on the Official Languages Committee myself. I think my colleague's motion would be more appropriate in the Official Languages Committee rather than this one. I understand the link with the CRTC, but the whole premise of his motion, that I haven't read on paper, but the premise of his motion strikes me that Francophones have had their rights flouted. And this is an issue that affects Francophonie and official languages. Now, at the Official Languages Committee in the past, we heard from witnesses from the CRTC on a number of occasions, as well as Statistics Canada. So I think it would be more appropriate that this motion be moved in the OLO Committee rather than here, especially given that our schedule is loaded up for the upcoming months. And I know that you want, sir, to avoid unnecessary incidents and, for example, casualties occurring. But I think the Official Languages Committee has more time at their disposal to study the issue. And it's a highly relevant issue. I agree with you. Thank you, Mr. Généreux. Mr. Savard-Tremblay, followed by Mr. Massé. Well, I just wanted to mention in response to that comment, on paper, it may seem more appropriate for the Official Languages Community, but the Official Languages Community looks after the institutional official languages aspect, whereas this particular case, well, it's the CRTC that's the regulatory authority that's in charge of this matter, and we're not talking about an institutional language issue, but a private company here, and the minister who's in charge is the industry minister, and that's why I think he should be held to account on this matter. Thank you, Mr. Massé.
Chair, and this might help for newer members to the committee. This committee in the past, and this is why I will support this motion, actually looked at the failing of the telcos on the 911 problem that we had about 7 years ago. So we actually broke, if my memory serves me correct, which is I think we actually even had a couple special meetings for it where we reconvened during the summer. And that was related to the 911 call failure. There was two of them, actually. There was one most recently where the minister had to call from Japan to get somebody from Rogers and others because they were fighting over the jurisdiction. So there's that. And then prior to that, I believe it was, and I'm just having to go from memory right now, it was in the Ottawa area related to tornadoes and other inclement weather that had 911 failures at that time as well. So given that we've had this kind of look with the CRTC before related to 911, I'll support my colleague on this motion.
Mr. Généreux. Sorry, Mr. Généreux. Mr. Patzer first.
Thank you very much. It's, I guess, more of just a technicality of sort. The paragraph where it says, considering that the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission is the government body responsible for regulating IP telephony. That's just that wording right there, IP telephony, that actually refers to a very specific type of phone that people use, generally speaking. So I know it wouldn't necessarily preclude the study from limiting other types of telecommunication services that are provided, but that is actually a very specific type of service that people get, phone over using your phone over IP, rather than an analog line or even a digital line. So I don't know if there's a way to maybe clarify that it would be all telephone systems, not just one specific type, just to make sure it fully captures the breadth of the phone systems that people use. For example, I would only install an IP set when I worked in the industry in a business location, and only in some locations. It wasn't widespread usage just yet, but I don't recall. The only instance where I ever installed it into a residential area was a lady that worked from home. She had her own business that she ran out of her house as a call center type person. So it'd be very, very, very small sample of the public that would use an IP phone. So just to make sure that we have, an accurate summation for people that are calling 911, probably less than 1% would be doing it over an IP phone.
Mr. Patzer, I'm not sure if based on are you suggesting an amendment? Because what I would advise is maybe, from what I'm guessing, the Conservatives seem to be opposed to the motion. I haven't heard from the Liberals. No, you're not? Okay, because I thought, Mr. Généreux, je pensais que vous aviez dit que vous auriez préféré que ce soit
Mr. Généreux, you wanted it to be referred to the Official Languages Committee, this motion. Well, no, I was simply saying that it would be more appropriate, but in light of my colleague's explanations, indeed, I understand that this is a matter for the Industry Committee. Now, personally speaking, what I would suggest, now, just like the previous motion that we just passed, I think we should set a timeline. Hold on a tick, Mr. Généreux. We'll come back to you. Mr. Patzer, is this an amendment you're moving? And if it is, well, what's the wording for that? amendment? Well, before Mr. Patzer moves an amendment, I just want to chime in and see whether that amendment would be necessary. I just want to clarify this is not a rare phenomenon. There have been articles on this issue of IP telephones. There have been cases in our constituencies, but apparently the issue with 911 call centres doesn't only have to do with IP telephony. I'm prepared to study the other types of telephony, but I understand that there are some cases that aren't linked to IP telephony. We're not going to be against motherhood and apple pie, and we're willing to study that aspect too. Well, perhaps the motion, says the Chair, is broad enough, and therefore that we can look at other particular cases of telephony under this motion. But Mr. Patzer, would you still have the floor? Would you like to make an amendment?
In light of what Mr. Savard-Tremblay has just mentioned.
Can I just ask him a question? Is that okay?
I will allow.
Is this then in regards to the phone systems that they are using in the 911 call centers specifically? Is that what you are specifically requesting in the study?
Je vais être certain de bien comprendre
Well,
la
I just want to
question.
make sure I understood your question properly. The wording of my motion, it's about whether the actions that were promised back in January are already being followed up on and what the state of affairs is. There was a promise that action would be taken. Now, it's not up to us to deal with the technical details. It's up to the relevant authorities. But this study would help us to understand where we're at. We know there were promises in January. We know over the summer those promises weren't kept. So it's just about understanding where we're at, but I'm not sure I understood your question fully.
My concern is that if it's simply because the 911 call centers use an IP phone, then sure, let's study the impacts of IP telephony. But there's a very specific, this is a cell phone. It's not an IP phone. It utilizes multiple technologies, but this is not an IP phone, right? The Cisco phones we all have in our offices, that's an IP phone. Your landline you have at your house, that's not an IP phone. So it's a very technical thing. I'm kind of geeking out here because I worked in the industry, I guess, but I'm just making sure that there's not going to be any issues that would come up in the study because we only narrowly prescribed it to IP telephony when at the end of the day, most people don't use IP telephones. The call centers might, but the person who is phoning the call center looking for help, they're most likely not using an IP phone.
Je vais juste laisser vite fait, monsieur.
Well, go ahead, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. If you'd be quick, please. Well, that's not the issue. It's not the call centres we're talking about here. We're talking about individuals, citizens in Quebec, given the penetration of Videotron. There are a lot of IP phones in Quebec, in the regions. So we're talking about folks who've called from their IP phones and they've been transferred to call centres in Ontario and then they couldn't get the service in French. That's the issue. We're talking about individuals. We're not talking about the 911 service that's using IP telephony. Thank you, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. I think that clarifies things. Mr. Patzer, you can tell me if you want to submit an amendment. Nevertheless, maybe you want to do so, but I think Mr. Savard-Tremblay has clarified the terms of his motion.
Yeah, that clarified it for me. I was missing the transfer link there into Ontario and then back. So, yeah, no, I'm good.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur. J'ai Monsieur Généreux suivi de
Mr. Généreux, followed by Mr. Turnbull. Well, what I was saying earlier, given the motion that passed earlier, we set a time frame, and I think we should have a time frame for this study too. We don't know when we'll receive the government's amendments on C27. So what about a time frame, i.e. that this study be conducted when we get back? I don't know if we can include that in the motion, but that's a friendly amendment. Can we have a time frame, Mr. Savard-Tremblay? If this study needs to be done at some point, if it's urgent, well, then I think he should clarify that it's urgent and provide a time frame. Well, in that case, we need an amendment to tack onto the motion, Mr. Généreux. It's a bit vague what you just said. Could you spell it out for us? Well, I suggest the following amendment, that the study be completed before the end of February 2025. 2028? No, 2025. You're ahead of yourself. So end of February 2025, that's Mr. Généreux's motion.
Be conducted before February, the end of February 2025. Any comments on the amendment? Is it, do I have unanimous consent for the amendment proposed? I see the thumbs up from Mr. Massé, and I don't see any objections on the amendment, which would say that the study must take place before the end of February 2025. To be completed. So thank you. It's agreed and so ordered. Back to the motion as presented and as amended. I had Mr. Turnbull.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So good discussion here. Thanks to Mr. Savard Tremblay for bringing this forward. I think my understanding is the CRTC is bound by the Official Languages Act, so they are bound by it. As far as I know, they jumped on the issues fairly quickly, and I'll maybe just provide a little bit of detail to that. The CRTC in January distributed several letters to the telecom industry players requesting information on recent incidents in which 911 callers were unable to access service in French. So there were some issues. The letters were sent to mobile service providers such as Rogers, VoIP service provider, Transat Telecom, and third-party call center Northern 911. And so they had until February 2nd to provide information. The three parties are also required to provide details on any existing provisions in their respective service agreements regarding the provision of French language or bilingual services. So that's also important to note. We also have documentation that there's been, so I think some of the issues were resolved. I think there had been a couple of cases since Gatineau where lines were relayed to Ottawa centres, and that those would have been unilingual speakers. So, so I wanted to ask Mr. Savard Tremblay whether there were specific instances in specific places or localities that he's referring to. I mean, part of why I think I'm sort of inclined to say, you know, similar to what Mr. Généreux had said initially, is that this seems to be more of an official languages study, but I really want to understand what locale and specific incidences that he might be referring to in the motion.
Je peux vous donner un exemple particulier.
Well, I can give you one specific example that occurred in the summer in Berthier-Maskinongé riding. There was a case. I'm not sure of the exact locality. My colleague told me about it, and when it was flagged at a meeting with other colleagues chimed in and said, oh, we've had cases like this. So the idea is to study that issue in depth. I know that this whole issue hasn't been entirely resolved because these cases continue to occur, and maybe it would be good if colleagues, in fact, to check in with their constituents to see if they're experiencing issues. I know that it is an overlapping issue.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, puis...
Thank you, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. Now, I was wondering myself whether there is an argument for this motion being dealt with at the Official Languages Committee. There's arguments against as well. But in my opinion, there's a sufficient link with telecoms that this be in order here. But I defer, of course, to the committee's will on the matter. Would someone else like to speak to this motion as amended? No? In that case, Mr. Turnbull.
This would be better suited for the Official Languages Committee. I really see that because the CRTC is subject to the Official Languages Act, and it must abide by that. It seems to me that it might be better placed there, because this is an issue with service being provided in English when it should be provided in French, right? And I think that to me is an issue that is an important one. So I don't mean to sound like I'm saying it's not an issue. It is an issue, and it's important, so I agree. But I just think it would be better placed in that committee. So that's where I stand on it. So thanks.
Mr. Perkins, you don't have the floor, but it's nice to hear. I have Mr. Massey, and did you want the floor, Mr. Perkins? Okay, Mr. Massey.
Try again on this because, first of all, we're then jettisoning something here to another committee, expecting that other committee to abandon their schedule for something that we're doing here, which really is going to be the death knell most likely to it, not knowing what their committee's doing. And then on top of that, anything that they recommend will have to go back to the CRTC anyways, which will then be out of their jurisdiction and their minister that they deal with for the issue. And then lastly, we have dealt with 911 in the industry specifically on this on 2 separate file cases that were very specific to 911. And as well, it's been raised in numerous testimony to the telcos and also the CRTC several times during other testimony when we've studied the issues related to coverage in rural and remote communities, which this committee does actually have a study on, and I believe there are some recommendations in those studies related to it. So for those reasons, I still think it's appropriate that we deal with this. We all have our different issues that we've been raising here, and to be fair, I don't believe that there's been also a block issue that's been studied recently here on this committee as well, and so it's not that there is a history of them not bringing numerous studies to the committee as well too. So I think the members done the due diligence necessary and support dealing with this in the constraint, and especially the constrained way that we have. And if we do this, I would ask that the reports previously with 911 that this committee be brought back so all members would have that in front of them before we have the opportunity to be well prepped. So for those reasons, I still support of this motion because it would be continuing practice of the work we've done on 911.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. When we'll cross the bridge when we get to the river, but it's a fair point that we look at what the committee has done in the past on this, so that we don't replicate it. But are there any other speakers on the motion as amended? I will put it to a vote then, Madame Lagreffière.
On the motion of Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, as amended, Mr. Turnbull.
Oppose.
Mr. Arias.
No.
Mr. Badaway. Mr. Gahir.
Oppose.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Oppose.
Mr. Perkins.
I'm opposed, but support it going to official languages.
Sorry?
I'm opposed to this motion, but support it going to official languages.
Well, so opposed. Mr. Généreux.
Oppose.
Mr. Patzer.
No.
Ms. Rempel-Garner.
No.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Oh, je change pas d'idée. Ça va.
I haven't changed my mind. Stick to my guns.
Bon, la motion est défaite et
Motion is defeated. Regrettably, Mr. Savard-Tremblay, especially given it's your first motion in this committee. Now, I don't think you're very welcoming to me. Well, you'll see, we will be. But I don't think that this can just be referred over just at the drop of a hat. It ain't as easy as that, but I know that Mr. Généreux sits on the Official Languages Committee, and I can talk to Mario Beaulieu. I know he sits on it, and as Mr. Généreux mentioned, for the time being, that committee has less on its plate than the Industry Committee. I think there's a lot of empathy around the table for this issue that you've raised, which is of great import. And I'll count on Mr. Généreux. I'll be looking at what goes on at the Official Languages Committee to make sure that this gets through. Well, it's up to the Bloc Québécois, says Mr. Généreux at the end of the day. But thank you very much, Mr. Savard-Tremblay, for having raised this issue. Highly appreciated. On my list, I have Mr. Massé now. Thank you.
In committee business, Mr. Massé, you're good. You're
Good, thank you.
So then I had Mr. Patzer, and then I think I have MP Badaway.
Thank you very much, Chair.
If we get there.
I have a motion here that was talked about previously, that in relation to the committee's ongoing study of credit card practices, and given various departments have refused to answer questions and produce documentation related to the committee's ongoing study, the committee therefore ordered the department to produce A, Honourable Michelle Rempel-Garner's request for any briefing notes and summary documents prepared by the department related to the Government of Canada's consultation process on reducing interchange fees, including any and all written submissions received by stakeholders. B, MP Jean-Denis Garon's request for all copies of Visa and MasterCard's initial offer to reduce interchange fees, including any and all counteroffers by the department, as well as any and all email exchanges related to these negotiations between Visa, MasterCard, and American Express. C, MP Brian Massey's request for any advice letters or memorandums provided to the Minister on the matter of reducing interchange fees or credit card reductions more broadly, that these documents be produced to the committee within 14 days following the adoption of this motion, unredacted and in both official languages. So I think it's important because when we look at some of the committee testimony that we did here, and I think the lack of answers that were provided when we had government officials and also these companies here, the production of these documents would be extremely helpful for this committee to be able to get answers and results for Canadians as to why things continue to be the way they are in that ecosystem. So I think it's good to do this motion. I think it ties in what the parties had all heard and seen in committee. It respects the wishes of multiple parties here. So I think this is a good one that the committee can get done quickly. It won't interfere with any of our meetings that we are trying to schedule. It's just simply asking for these documents, and it provides a very clear timeline for when they need to come, and obviously in both official languages, and clearly be unredacted, so that way we get the information that this committee is requesting. It's entirely within the rights and ability of this committee to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Monsieur Patzer, juste, je note que c'est une motion qui avait déjà été présentée, mais sur laquelle on n'avait pas statué. Donc, it's fair game to bring it back because we had started to debate it, but we had to adjourn. I'll just note one thing in the French version. We have l'honorable Michel Garon. Je pense qu'on veut bien dire l'honorable Michel Rempel-Garner. C'est peut-être faire cette modification-là. Et sinon, sur ma liste, j'ai... Est-ce que c'était à ce sujet-là, M. Savard?
Moi, c'était juste pour souligner que Mme Rempel-Garner avait droit.
Say that Mrs. Rempel-Garner has the right to her own name. That's... for everything else, we agree and we will support the motion.
Turnbull.
I think that we had Mr. Turnbull.
We had... on this topic was a good one where I think we all got into asking some pretty tough questions of the witnesses. We also clarified with the departmental folks to provide the documentation that's referenced here, and that they agreed to do that in their testimony that they would provide that documentation to the committee. So I feel like this motion is moot in the sense that they've already agreed to provide the very documentation which is being referred to here. So what I wanted to do is ask if the clerk or the chair has received any of those documentation yet, because I believe that they are forthcoming already, and the committee should probably take note of those and review those before we go requesting anything in addition to that. And I don't think that this is adding any value, to be honest, but if we were to think that there's a need to ask for additional information, then maybe we could craft a motion that is tailored to that specific need if we feel like the documentation is somehow insufficient or whatever. But I think what my understanding is that they were going to provide that documentation and that it is forthcoming. So could we just do a double check as to whether we've received anything yet?
Yes, to your question, MP Turnbull, the clerk has received indeed last night information from Finance, and it was just sent to committee members right now. It is also available in the digital binder. So, but it's just been sent at 10 a.m. this morning. So, do you still have anything to add, Mr. Turnbull, or
Well, obviously, we haven't had a chance, because we've been in this committee, to review that documentation. I would suggest that if this is a real priority for us as a committee, that we take the time to review that documentation before, voting on a motion that is sort of redundant in that, maybe there's something that's of substance still left in this motion after that documentation has been provided. But I think we should take the time to review it to understand, what is actually there, what has been provided, what is the committee desired that may not have been met. And if that is the case, in fact, which I don't think it will be, I think that it will be fairly thorough, but that we should give the benefit of the doubt to the officials that provided the very information that this committee was unanimous in requesting from them.
I can imagine. MP Rempel-Garner.
Just for my colleagues, what has been at the very last minute provided from finance officials to this committee is not what this motion has requested. I actually can read very quickly, thank you. That's why I'm successful in my career and typically outflank the Liberals on most things. Thank you. But thank you for trying to presuppose my reading abilities, Mr. Turnbull. I assure you they are very adequate. Thank you. So what has been submitted by the government is talking points. It's not what what was requested by any of the members who are mentioned in this motion, and I think we should proceed with the production order. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Massé.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One, I'm going to support this, and if it is redundant, then it's fine. Then they can weed out those parts that are redundant, and we go for the information that we get. So it kind of actually apply the logic that's being used here to the benefit of what the committee could receive. And then second to that is the timeline that we have here is my only concern is that we should have some flexibility with regards to making sure at the end of the day, it doesn't hold up the report or anything else like that. It could be added value later, whatever it might be. So if we get into a document issue. But the meeting that a lot of this came out of is one of the most successful meetings, I think, that was highlighting a lot of the issues that we're dealing with. So hopefully this information will make our report even stronger.
Monsieur Massé, j'ai Monsieur Turnbull, je crois. Puis,
Mr. Turnbull, I think. Anyone else?
Email from the clerk at 10:04. Ms. Rempel-Garner's intervention was at 10:08. There's
yes,
over
I can
40,
read. Point of order.
40 pages
Point of order.
documents.
1 second, Mr. Turnbull. There's a point of order by.
Point of order. I can read. I would like to assure my colleagues that I can read, and I can assure the colleagues that there are not briefing notes and summary documents. They're not briefing notes in the package that was sent.
Thank
That
you,
is related
MP
to me.
Rempel-Garner.
So
that is not
since-
a point.
since-
MP
since-
Rempel-Garner, please.
On decorum, though, Chair.
That is not a point of order.
My colleague is impugning my ability to read. I assure
he is
you,
not
A,
in-
B, C, D,
he-
E, F, G,
MP
this
Rem-
girl can R, E, 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 D.
MP Rempel-Garner, this is not a point of order, and Mr. Turnbull, you have the floor.
Thank you. As I was saying, there's about 4 minutes between the time that we received these documents. There's over 50 pages as I count. I haven't had a chance to read them myself, but would be welcome to debate this motion after having read those documents, because I would like to actually look at what's being proposed and ordered here in this motion as a series of documentation and compare what we've received specifically to what's being requested here. And I think that's more than fair, that we don't waste the committee's time. And I think that this is a waste of the committee's time. If we've already received the documents, let's have a look at what they contain and what information has been provided. There was a lot of work, obviously, that went into this at our request when the witnesses were here. And I think respectfully, we should honor the fact that we made that request. The woman whose name I'm forgetting right now, I remember clarifying with her what we were specifically requesting, and she made a commitment on the record that she would provide that documentation. It hasn't been that long of a time. Chair, maybe we could clarify when that meeting was and how long it's taken, because obviously documentation takes some time to put together at the committee's request, but how long has that been?
It was the 7th? So it was on the 7th that we had that meeting, correct? Yeah.
So the 7th of November?
Correct.
So 14 days. So it's taken 14 days to put together over 50 pages of documentation at the committee's request and been provided to the committee. Come on, let's be clear here. That's a sufficient and realistic amount of time. I don't think anyone can say that the officials didn't do their job to provide the documentation that we requested. We may have some differences of opinion about, well, have they provided sufficient, detailed information in specific areas? But we have not had the chance to read over 40 pages of documents in the 4 minutes between the time that that email was sent and the 4 minutes later. I don't know whether you're a speed reader, maybe all of you are, and you were reading as you were talking into the record here, but I think that's clearly nonsense. We need to focus on the fact that this committee.
But there is a point of order, Mr. Massey.
Just how he's making personal qualifications on another member here and so forth. So just maybe we can take it a step back on that. Now he's actually breaking the timeline down to 4 minutes and so forth. Make the points, but.
But thank you, Mr. Massey, and I'll just I'll wait a second on that. I was listening very closely to Mr. Turnbull because I think it's threading on he has to thread carefully. However, I've noticed that he was talking about the fact that for most members around this table, 4 minutes is not enough time to read 50 pages. And he's been talking about him as a member, and he is asked to vote on a motion, so are other members. And he wasn't targeting anyone in the last couple of minutes that I've been listening to his speech, so I'll leave him pursue.
And I'm not...
Point of order.
Mr. Patzer.
Yeah, just in the amount of time that Mr. Turnbull's been speaking, I was able to flip through all those documents. And I can tell you there's nothing in there about reducing interchange fees or the counter offers between the departments, between Visa and MasterCard. It was all copy
Mr.
and
Patzer,
pasted
that's not a point of
things
order,
such as a code of conduct, which wasn't even part of the
Mr.
request.
Patzer, I'll add you to the list if you want, Mr. Patzer. You consider it done. And Mr. Turnbull.
To my point, though, most of us have not had a chance, and Mr. Patzer may have done a superficial flip through of documents, but I would like the time personally to actually read through and see what was provided. And I think that's pretty fair and realistic. And there may actually be more than 50 pages of documents, and I think that those are substantive pieces of information that this committee should take the time to review. I think that's more than fair. I think for like if Canadians were watching this committee, I hope they are. You know, the documents have been provided that were requested by this committee on a particularly important issue that we've chosen to study as a committee, and I think all of us have specific concerns around interchange fees and making sure that we hold both credit card companies and some of the other stakeholders that are involved in that complex system accountable. And but we have very specific sets of information here that I really think that it makes sense to review before we go requesting additional documentation. So that's my perspective on it. I think we should, maybe revisit this at a future meeting, and maybe this is Mr. Patzer's motion, I believe, but maybe he could take the time to review it, and then we could discuss at a future meeting as to whether there's anything, that's left that's desirable for the committee to make its determinations around what's been provided. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Turnbull, your timing is perfect because we're at the end of this meeting, so we'll have to bring this back at some later point. Mr. Perkins.
I'd like to seek a unanimous consent, which I think there is in the committee, to move the following motion, that the committee invite Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne to testify on supplementary estimates B 2024-2025 for 2 hours by no later than the end of the current supply period.
Yes, I'm looking around. That's usual practice that we invite the minister on sub. So that is a fantastic note to end this meeting. Thank you, Mr. Perkins, for bringing consensus right at the end. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. La rencontre est ajournée.
This meeting is adjourned.